So hi, everyone. Thanks for sharing where you're from and what the weather's like where you are. Anything else you want to add is great. I myself, and my name is Erin McClintock, and I am Vice President for Community Engagement, Impact, and Education at an organization called EVERFI. We're a social impact educational technology company that many of your institutions probably work with through our courses, Alcohol EDU and Sexual Assault Prevention, as well as our DEI courses and our mental health courses. I come to this work with a clinical background, so I've been at EVERFI for 5 years, but prior to joining EVERFI, I worked as Director of Wellness at a university, and prior to that, I spent the bulk of my career doing mental health work, both in the K-12 space and in the community mental health space. I have the great privilege at EVERFI of sitting on a team called the Research and Impact Team, and we're comprised of researchers, practitioners, subject matter experts who make up different subject areas. And our main focus is both to develop our content and also to make sure that that content is grounded in the best possible research. And as part of that, we get to explore some really interesting insights that come out of our courses, both our K-12 courses, our higher ed courses, and our workplace courses. And Jesse and I, in both of our roles, have the chance to work across all three of those areas. So with that, I'm so excited to be joined by my brilliant colleague, Jessie Bridges, who I will allow to introduce herself.
I will pay you handsomely later for such a kind introduction, Erin. Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie Bridges, and as Erin said, thank you all for engaging with us in the chat already. We will do our level best to make sure that we're monitoring both the conversation as well as the visuals that you all are seeing here. As she said, my name is Jessie Rainey Bridges, and I currently serve as the Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at EVERFI. I've been with the organization for about 1.5 years now, and come to this work and serving as a counterpart to Erin, focused on topics in the intersectional topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion as related to creating living, learning, and working communities that are equitable, safe, and healthy for all. Prior to my work at EVERFI, I was with an organization called the Education Advisory Board, who some of you all might be familiar with, which leverage best practice research and predictive analytics to enhance student success outcomes. I led the charge on creating a platform for community college students to help navigate some of the gaps and the challenges that were presented by the onboarding process into their collegiate careers and degrees. And before that, I spent about 10 years on college campuses focused on access and equity issues, most recently at Purdue University, serving as the Associate Dean of Students and overseeing the Disability Resource Center. But my career is very much grounded in a focus on access and equity issues. I cut my professional teeth as a civil rights compliance officer on a college campus and have a background in mental health counseling. And so the worlds that come together when we talk about equity-based mental well-being and what does that look like in all of its different iterations and permutations is something that is really near and dear to my heart. And so as we talk about how to create psychological safety at the macro level, at the individual level, we're hoping that you will engage with us in dialogue today. Feel free to continue engaging in the chat. We'll create space for questions at the end, but certainly as you all have suggestions, insights, please make sure to raise your hand virtually, if you will, so that we can create learning and share learning together.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessie. And thank you all for being here today. So this is a brief agenda of what we're hoping to cover today. We're excited to have an hour with you. And we understand that in a virtual world, that can be a lot. So given that we're remote, we want to encourage you to do all the things that you need to do to take care of yourselves. Get up, stretch. We can't see you, so feel free to multitask as you have to, but we hope that you'll take value from what we have to say. The first thing that we're going to do is to cover some of the affirmations of the present. So this is an acknowledgement of the collective moment that all of us have lived through together and that many of us are still facing at our respective campuses and within our organizations. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the concepts of inclusive excellence and psychological safety and ways in which they intersect, as well as ways we might see them play out within the higher education setting. The third thing that we're going to do is we're going to dive deep into some data. We're going to look at what data tells us about students, about their behavior around health and wellness, about their mental health, both aggregated and disaggregated. And then we want to make sure that we're leaving you with some actionable takeaways. So we've identified 7 tactics that we're going to speak to throughout the presentation that we hope you'll be able to implement in your own efforts, whether you're representing an organization, an institution, or a community based group. As Jesse said, we welcome you to engage with us in the chat. Let us know if you have questions, thoughts. The group that is here today probably has as much wisdom to provide as we do, so we certainly welcome you to engage with one another as well. So it's really important as we, and I'm sure you've heard of this throughout the course of the conference, really can't have a session where we talk about mental health or diversity and inclusion without acknowledging all of the events that occurred in 2020. We had the COVID-19 pandemic. We had the growing movement that was sparked by outrage over the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others, which shone a light on issues that have been taking place for such a long time that are truly complex for our society. And for institutions of higher education, issues related to mental health and diversity, equity, and inclusion have never been more important.
Thank you, Erin. And as we take really a retrospect of the conditions that were set close to a year ago, and I'll take some time just to acknowledge, as we've been having conversations about the quote unquote 1 year anniversary of what became one of the most disruptive experiences in all of our lives in the world, abruptly shutting down and reconfiguring how we engage with each other. We do want to take some time just to acknowledge that there is still a residue of that collective trauma. And as we look back over the course of 2020, what we recognize is that we were all weathering and still are weathering a very similar storm, but we're doing so from remarkably different boats. And as 2020 has presented us and moving into 2021, in the first quarter of 2021, what we have seen is that not only has there been a disparate impact on communities and demographics that have been impacted by the pandemic, but then also the tangential results of that. So if you draw your attention to the top left headline snapshot, if you will, that reads "Coughing While Asian." What we have seen recently, and I would say very recently, is an acute uprise and an acute uptick of anti-Asian xenophobic sentiment based on the nomenclature of where the pandemic was originated from. And so with that, there again is not just the collective trauma of what we're all experiencing, but how that impacts particular demographics in uneven ways. And so with that is the intersection again of the global health pandemic, its relationship to equity-based issues, in addition to significant increased attention, rightfully so, around social justice movements and racial inequity.
Now, at the start of the pandemic, so a year ago, Jesse, that's a great point, Jeff Weiner, who's the former CEO of LinkedIn, shared what I thought was a really interesting observation, which was that in the beginning, people thought that COVID-19 was going to be the great leveler. And as it turns out, it's actually been an amplifier that has sharply accelerated gaps in healthcare, in jobs, and education that were already being experienced by underserved communities pre-pandemic. So as we think about the impact that it's had on our institutions of higher education, in many cases, it's quite the same. We've seen a spotlight that's been shown on inequity, where we've got professors who are seeing the homes of students, the various types of backgrounds that exist. Some students have their own space. Some students are sharing space with a number of friends. Some students don't even have the bandwidth to be able to attend class effectively if they're remote. We've seen bandwidth issues accessing the internet. We've also seen a spotlight shown on the need for whole student education. Right now, what students need isn't necessarily those textbook classes that we're tending to teach them, but there's also a real need for food, for shelter, for safety, security, health. We've seen technological divides illuminated, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as it relates to inclusivity and some of the barriers that might impact students to begin with. But we've also been forced to challenge and confront the status quo. The long-held stigma that so many schools had against remote learning, for instance, really being put under a microscope, and we had to pivot very quickly, and many schools were able to do that. Similarly for telehealth, counseling centers that historically maybe had not been, didn't feel like it was possible to do that are now able to provide that as a resource. And for some students, that's working really well. So as we think about what life in a post-COVID world looks like, it's really important to look at what's worked, how we had to confront some of those challenges in a really thoughtful way, and what can we bring with us into the future as it relates to supporting our students and our community members.
And in the backdrop of all of that, I think what could be easy to miss is there's a focus on the acute. How do we reimagine the world for the student experience, for equitable mental well-being? But what we can't ignore what's happening in the backdrop are these systemic barriers that have persisted and existed for quite some time when it came to educational attainment and educational outcomes. Certainly there are the layers of socioeconomic status that are coming to light and being illuminated even more so. There are also the other factors that play into that, how students are coming to the campus experience based on their childhood experiences, as well as their academic preparedness and their confidence and their cultural competence in approaching the higher education institutions based on that framework of prior academic preparedness, but then also we take into consideration community expectations and values, where students have to prioritize and reprioritize their commitments, and whether that be home and school life, whether that be work life and taking care of family, as well as kind of the community values of education. All of these really can present barriers that students are bringing to campus, and then also the social capital piece. And I talked a little bit earlier just about cultural capital, and I'll draw from my experience in working alongside community colleges and students who are coming there either for the first time in their collegiate experience or coming and returning to higher education. But being able to navigate systems of processes, terminology, vocabulary that are unfamiliar and inaccessible to many students create additional barriers either to the matriculation or the success through the higher education institutions. And so with that, we take all of that into consideration in the existing challenges, current challenges, and how do we augment together the resources and supports through the lens of creating greater equity for all. And what we'll turn to next is that our need to innovate as higher education institutions was not spurred on specifically by the pandemic. So Erin, I will turn that to you now. Oh, and actually, it looks like you might be on mute, Erin. Apologies. And so what you're seeing visualized here is that when we talk about the need to innovate and to reimagine the campus experience, again, as I said, that wasn't a direct result of the pandemic. This need to innovate or bust has existed in higher education for some time now. What you're seeing reflected on the left-hand side is the steady decline of student enrollment from the years of 2011 to 2019. And then what you're also seeing reflected on the right-hand side of the slide is an unevenness in graduating high school seniors and where are they going? And so the need to really focus on student success, and again, that enrollment into, matriculation through, and employment graduation from higher education institutions, that barrier, that need to innovate has existed for quite some time. And so while we have been very much focused on what are the enrollment drivers, we also can't ignore what are the conditions that are set on college campuses that can either be catalysts for student success or barriers and inhibitors.
And finally, as we look at the impact of COVID-19 in the past year, it's really important that we take our lens out a little bit and zoom out to recognize the fact that it is not just student mental health that's been impacted. And we are going to spend a lot of time today talking specifically about that. This is the Depression on College Campuses conference. It's something we all care a lot about. But it's really important to look at student well-being through a multidimensional lens. And I know so many institutions of higher education are doing this really well. But we have seen in really tangible ways the impact of 2020's events and what it's done to our intellectual well-being with academics paused, our spiritual well-being, our financial well-being. That ranked as one of the #1 concerns of college students at the start of the pandemic and throughout was the financial concern for their families, physical wellness, all of the different aspects of well-being that we tend to relate to are really important to consider as we're thinking about supporting the mental health of our students as well. So with that, we are going to turn it over to our next section. And as we do that, I wanted to share a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the quote is, "We are not makers of history, we are made by history." And that is the moment that we are in right now. And it's a defining one. And for many of us, we may be looking to this conference for ideas of how we can move into the next phase of life in a post-COVID world, and thinking through it with a lens of recovery, of growth, and of taking new practices with us. So that's really what we want to focus on now. So we'd love to invite you in the chat. We want to make sure we're able to gain a shared understanding of what psychological safety is. So in the chat, we'd love for you to spend a minute thinking about what comes to mind when you think of the term psychological safety. It may mean the things that you think define it. It could mean the things that for you help to create psychological safety when you're in new places. You're welcome to share it in the chat. You can also just hold it in your mind or write it down on a piece of paper if you don't want to share it. And so we're going to just take a minute to have all of you do this. And what we hope to draw parallels to is the fact that creating psychological safety is a little bit different for everyone. The things that I might need to feel psychologically safe are different than the things that Jessie might need, or different than the things that all of the people who are joining us today might need. And they're largely informed by our backgrounds, by our perceptions, by our perspectives, as well as our personal way of being. And we have to remember that each student who's coming into our community has their own experiences that have been formed by all of those aspects of their identity. So as we go through this presentation, we're going to try to paint with as broad of a brush as we possibly can. But one key takeaway that we want to make sure we're highlighting right off the bat is that you need to know your own community. So who's there, what their expectations are, what they need, what information don't you have that could empower you to make positive decisions. Really important for you to hopefully call to mind your own community and think about the things that we're sharing and how those might resonate within the school or the organization that you call home.
Erin, I'll just lift up some of the themes that I see coming into the chat. I see thematically empathy, inclusion, belonging, being free of judgment, comfort, calm. There's one that's interesting, absence of cruelty. And I really appreciated this comment, normalizing not being perfect, asking for help and saying I'm hurting. And that concept of help-seeking behavior and feeling the permission to do so is one that we'll talk about here as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessie. And thank you all for sharing your perspectives. So by definition, here are two perspectives on psychological safety. And there are many more out there. If you even do a simple Google search, you'll find likely a good amount of literature. But some of the first terms related to psychological safety were from William Kahn, who defined it as the ability to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. And then in his seminal work, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, Dr. Timothy Clark expanded upon this definition with the notion that psychological safety is actually comprised of 4 things. It's a condition in which you feel included, in which you feel safe to learn, in which you feel safe to contribute, and in which you feel safe to challenge the status quo, all without fear of being embarrassed, marginalized, or punished in some way. Now, throughout our presentation today, we're going to discuss the role that psychological safety plays in creating an environment of inclusive excellence. And we're going to examine how student well-being is a critical component of that. And we're going to root our exploration of psychological safety into the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're approaching the topic from the standpoint that in order to create psychological safety for community members, you need to closely examine your DEI efforts.
Thanks, Erin. And to take that framework a little bit closer to the ground in order to understand diversity, equity, inclusion, and psychological safety as they intersect with inclusive excellence, it's also imperative to consider, to explore, to reflect on the identities that not only your students are bringing to the space, but then also who you are bringing to the space as a part of this practice. And so as we talk about psychological safety, Erin, you lifted up the comment a little bit earlier that what safety looks like, what it feels like, how you understand it and conceptualize it and experience it is going to be remarkably different or slightly different, and there will be common denominators for each individual. And that is informed by what you'll see reflected here is our amalgamation of identities. We recognize that identity is 1, evolving, 2, dimensional, and 3, it's intersectional. And so as many of you I'm sure have seen before, there are lots of ways to visualize what we mean by identity and the perspectives, the identities, the backgrounds, the experiences that inform who we are and how we show up to the spaces that we're a part of each and every day. So this is really just one offering of a visual that, yes, there are core inherent identities that you're born with, traits, if you will. And then there are characteristics and attributes that you acquire along the way, whether that's in your professional settings, your personal experiences, your families of origin, geographically where you grew up in the world or in the nation. And all of those pieces come together to form opinions, perspectives, experiences, values, beliefs, etc., that you bring into the space. And so as we think about what inclusive excellence looks like, we have to recognize that it's remarkably personalized, but then also can be very differentiated. And so what we hope to do today is lift up some of those themes that can be applied across spectrums of identities and at intersections of identity.
Thanks, Jessie. So for all of the visual learners out there, here's another model that I find to be really helpful. And I'd love to invite you, as I'm talking about this, to call to mind a student that you may have worked with. Don't have to assign anything to them. Just think about a student that you have worked with in your career and think about their experience at each level of what I'm about to share. So one of the things that a lot of schools are using and thinking about and working towards creating psychological safety for community members is inclusive excellence, which we're going to talk about momentarily. But this depiction here is actually a visual analogy of the socio-ecological model as applied to psychological safety. So all the way on the outside in the purple, you have institutional components, which is what we're going to spend a good amount of our time talking about today. This includes things like structures that exist within our communities, access to resources, equity, feeling a sense of belonging, feeling like someone has their basic needs, health and safety needs met. Next, you've got relational components. And so these are who an individual is connected to. Do they have people that they're connected to? Do they feel a sense of belonging within a group, whether it's a small group or a bigger group? It is looking at, making sure that people have others that they can confide in, that they can connect with. And then, of course, we have the individual level factors. These are the things that a person has internally, the skills that they have, like resilience, knowledge, adaptability, self-confidence, belief. In his seminal work, Bandura stressed the importance of the social context and the interaction with others as part of the learning process. And so as we're seeking to create higher ed environments where all students can thrive and where all students are able to feel supported and feel psychologically safe to the degree that it's possible, it's really important that we're exploring some of the various contexts and layers that can contribute to that. So for those of you who called a student to mind, would love for you to think about through this lens, are we doing everything we possibly can at all of these levels to signal to that student that we are seeking to create an environment where they are welcome and feel a sense of belonging?
And as we consider that socio-ecological model, where this comes into play, or where inclusive excellence really starts to influence and inflect a culture of psychological safety and institutionalizing vulnerability, as we talked about in the title, what we want to draw your attention to now is the framework of inclusive excellence, and unpack that just a little bit. Many of you might be familiar with the inclusive excellence framework. It was commissioned by the Association of American Colleges and Universities and was really a focus on a multi-year initiative to help universities first integrate their diversity and equality efforts and initiatives, but then two, also to situate the work as a part of the core institutional functioning. And so moving from having a framework of diversity inclusion or diversity equity inclusion as adjacent, but really core to institutional functioning, and then also to help realize the benefits that are available to students and to the institution when integration is done well and when it's sustained over time. And so that sustainable focus on an integrated model throughout the entire campus experience is really the aim of inclusive excellence. And so just as a quick orientation to the framework, I'll start at the top of the cycle. And so that kind of lavender circle at the very top is focusing on access and equality. And in this lens, it's really anchoring on the idea of compositional diversity or representation, having that community of belonging, connection, and shared experience. The equitable representation of students, of faculty, and staff is one of the critical considerations as you think about a healthy campus ecosystem. And then as we move clockwise to the cycle, we'll look at the curricular and the co-curricular offerings of diversity. And so do students see their experiences, the research, the researchers, the scholars, but then also the practices reflected in their curricular and their co-curricular experiences that then affirm that feeling of belongingness, as you all lifted up in the chat in terms of what psychological safety feels like. And then we also have student learning and development, as well as climate. And so what is the assessment of climate? How are we taking the quote unquote temperature of students on campus? And again, all of this is longitudinal, sustainable. And then also I'm seeing in the chat, Erin, that it looks a little bit blurry, but we can certainly send the slides afterward to make that a little bit clearer and crisper for you all. And so again, this is a 4-part framework that sits over a multi-year longitudinal strategy to make sure that an intention around inclusion and equity and diversity is integrated into every component of the student experience in the campus, I would say in the living learning communities at our campuses. And so with that, we'll talk a little bit more, and I'll pass it back over to Erin for another visualized framework of how we consider the different layers by which psychological safety can be integrated into the campus experience.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry that there's some difficulty seeing the slides. We will make the slides available for folks after the session for sure. So this is another framework stemming from the next framework to the next framework. And this is really the framework that we at EVERFI think about well-being through, campus health and safety through, and this is called the impact framework. And so this is a framework that we're going to use to sort of ground what we talk about today in terms of actual recommendations that we can give you. So the first level of the framework sits at the bottom. And what you'll see there is institutionalization. This is the degree to which an issue is institutionalized within a community. This is having a senior leader who cares about it, having a president that's vocal around it, having the resources necessary to support it. In the case of mental health, this is having more than 3 counselors and also thinking about prevention. In the case of diversity and inclusion, this is not DEI work taking place in one office within the campus community. It's embedded throughout. Critical processes are the data that we're using to make actionable changes towards whatever our goal is. This is looking at what we have available from a student standpoint, a faculty standpoint, a staff standpoint, and engaging in a strategic planning process that's data-driven. It's identifying a goal and using data to get towards that goal, as well as to track our progress as we're going forward. And it's also communicating that data out, helping the community to feel invested in whatever it is that an institution is committed to. The third piece at the top is policy. So this is in yellow, and policy is really focused on accountability, not just around state and federal laws. So for instance, providing the mandated trainings that you have to, but also around how are we enforcing procedures and policies within our communities? Are we being equitable in our practices? Are we making sure that policies are grounded in well-being rather than in solely in discipline? Are our policies coming from a place of wanting to create safer, healthier communities? And then finally, at the top, we have programming. And you'll notice that in this visual depiction, programming is the smallest part of the framework. For many of us, though, it feels like the most important, right? This is what many of us probably spend a good amount of our time doing. And this is very much an external indicator of all of the things that are happening in institutionalization, critical processes, and policy. So as we go through our presentation today, towards the end, we're going to provide some concrete examples of what it looks like when an institution is doing really great work in each area of this framework. So all that said, we are going to go into a little bit of the need, understanding what do we know about the issues, how do we take what we've just talked about and translate it into what is data telling us.
Up where Erin paused us on the programmatic element. Again, oftentimes, we think about that as this. It is very much one of the critical pieces of an overarching framework of prevention, of creating psychological safety and inclusion on campus. And what we were seeing, and we like to draw parallels from across really a lot of the partners that we serve. And so we had an opportunity to quorum with a series of K-12 educators late last summer to understand the need and the context around that programmatic element, specifically when it came to understanding concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, racial equity. And so what we heard from those teachers and those educators at the K through 12 setting, and so we consider that these are the educators who are priming, who are preparing, who are skilling the students who will be on your college campuses of tomorrow and today. And what we heard from those educators was that 80% of them saw diversity, equity, inclusion as the first one of the top two issues that were most pressing for students as well as for educators. So 80%, and that was only secondary to mental health and well-being. And so you bring those two concepts together and you see that there's a very powerful need that has been outlined as the two most pressing topics. And then also we were seeing that the K through 12 industry, school districts and individual schools were saying that teaching diversity inclusion is a school priority. But then when you juxtapose that to the statistic that you see on the far right of the slide, is that 87% of teachers felt unprepared or underprepared to teach around these topics. And so you see a distinctive need and priority. However, there's under preparation of these educators to have informed, skillful conversations that can be productive to the students who, again, are showing up on our campuses in terms of how do I interact collaboratively, respectfully, in communities where not everyone thinks, behaves, assumes, and looks exactly the way that I do. And so we saw, again, that distinctive need that educators were lifting up, that while this is a priority, the skill set, the foundational muscle to be built around collaborating in an ever diversifying community was certainly a space where we had an opportunity to support and was certainly needed. Still on mute. I apologize.
Thank you for telling me that. I would have kept talking. So as I was saying when I was on mute, one of the things that we also have insights into from our higher ed data set is what students already know. So this is from a survey that we sent out to incoming college students as they were participating in an orientation training. I believe this was from our Alcohol EDU course. And we asked them, what have you already received training on as you're entering into college? And here we see the results. So we see that optimistically, there are some areas that students are receiving some amount of training on in high school. Things like alcohol and other drugs, healthy relationships, and how to be an active bystander. But when we dig a little bit deeper, we see that less than half of students have received any education on some of the critical concepts related to inclusive excellence within our communities, being an ally, inclusion, equity. So we can't make the assumption that students are coming into our communities having already received any kind of formal education on these topics, even though we know anecdotally, particularly as it relates to Gen Z, there's a strong interest in wanting to do meaningful work related to DEI. So knowing what we know about the role that sense of belonging plays on student mental health, these are some of the key things that we have to think about as it relates to creating healthy and inclusive campus communities and responsible global citizens as well. So that brings us to our very first tactic. Jesse, you want to take this one or you want me to?
Absolutely, I can run through. But as is reflected here, our first tactic and suggestion and recommendation is to make diversity education. And I distinguish it a little bit from diversity education and diversity training. Both are necessary. And the dialogue around topics of diversity a part of the community experience. And so, this could look like formal training programs or courses on topics that are related to allyship, cultural literacy courses, and power and oppression. And it also could be specific focus areas on academic tracks that allow students to get credit for courses that are related to understanding diverse populations. And so what we see is that there's need for the population level foundational understanding of, again, what does it mean to be a conscientious and global citizen? What does it mean to respectfully, collaboratively interact within a community that has a diversity of perspectives, identities, and experiences? But then also, what are the ways that we engage those skills in peer level, in one-to-one interactions? And so there's a form of thinking that diversity education and diversity training is actually training towards a critical life skill. And that's where, there is an opportunity to leverage peer support, social groups, but then the skill building around what LinkedIn in 2020 called, the top 20 soft skills. And one of that was collaboration. And if we're training towards, the success outcomes of students on your campus today, but then also the necessary skills that they will need as they go into the workforce, that ability to collaborate, to understand perspectives that are different from their own is a critical skill and competency that we have an opportunity to train toward. And so as we move on, what we also see is that fear and tribalism, which can be remarkably polarizing, are on the rise. And this data snapshot was taken from our 2019 survey responses within the diversity, equity, and inclusion course for students that's hosted by EVERFI. And so even prior to the heightened sense of anxiety and tribalism that has resulted from the pandemic, over half of the respondents reported that they had witnessed some form and act of racism. I am expectant that once we are able to dive into more of our 2020 research and data set, that we'll see an increase in the reporting of those acts of racism. So as an example, there's a Human Rights Watch report that was from May of 2020 about the increase in the rise of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. And it was a worldwide experience. And so there was one quote from the United Nations Secretary General that said, "The pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering, and urged governments to act." And so you're seeing again those increases and spikes across the nation and across the world of acts of racism at their institution. But then you juxtapose that to, if we can go to the next slide, and how we are preparing and training students in preparing them to respond to that. And you'll see in the bottom right slide that's in the goldenrod box now that only 7% of those same students who were queried had previously received any training on diversity, equity, inclusion. And so again, if we position this as a critical life skill, not a conceptual topic, but a skill in how to respect and value difference, to define common denominators and create shared experience, there was a rise in polarizing behavior, and then also a dearth of the support on the skill set to be able to engage respectfully, to interrupt microaggressions or acts of hate, and then what to do to create a campus community of inclusion and belonging.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessie. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. And for the next few minutes, we're going to look at some data that's related to student well-being, student drinking rates, mental health challenges, and the importance of identifying not just the behaviors that our students are engaging in, but also the behaviors that they aren't engaging in, as well as a mechanism for exploring psychological safety further. So the first thing that I want to start with, and I believe strongly that probably everyone on this call is in agreement with this, but I always like to lead with the fact that we're primarily talking about Gen Z for the purposes of this presentation. And it's also really important to highlight the many strengths that they bring. Gen Z is the most culturally accepting generation. They are likely to talk about mental health more than any other, sometimes to the frustration of us that are trying to work in the mental health space that get petitions signed on a regular basis. And I may or may not be speaking from experience when I was on a campus. They want honest portrayals of their experiences and authentic connections. They naturally want to help their friends, and they're most likely to go to friends first when they're in distress. There are a number of different strengths that exist among Gen Z. And as we think about creating environments of inclusive excellence, it's worth noting that many students are expecting to come into college and or to go into the workforce with the notion that they have the resources that they need, both to feel safe and supported, but also to feel like they have access to mental health care if they need to seek it out. And it's also important to consider wellness across the board. So first, we're going to take a look at some data on behaviors related to substance misuse. And these are pre-pandemic data points, but they're important to consider as we're anticipating what we might see when students return to our campus communities, and to highlight some of the differences that can exist. So oftentimes, there's a stereotype that college is all about engaging in high-risk drinking. Many students, although decreasingly so, are coming in with that expectation or that belief. But data tells us something really interesting. Across the board, we know that students are drinking less than they have in previous years, and that there are more students who are entering college as abstainers and fewer who are entering as high-risk drinkers. Now, among students of color, the majority are abstainers. And when it comes to surviving interpersonal violence, which is another topic that all students are often educated on in college as part of their orientation or as part of efforts that are taking place throughout the community, we see high rates across the board, but particularly high for students of color who are also gender nonconforming. So as we're considering the concept of psychological safety as it relates to student belonging and student well-being, it's really important to think about how are we accounting for the fact that most students within our communities do not drink in a high-risk way? What signals are we sending in our alcohol efforts that support that decision, that affirm that decision, that send the message to all other students that, hey, the majority of your peers are engaging in pretty healthy behavior? And then also, how are we creating programmatic opportunities that promote and support healthy behaviors in addition to reducing harmful ones? And then meanwhile, along the same lines, we have some national data that looks at who we are reaching. So this is from the EVERFI's diagnostic inventories, which ask institutions about who they're specifically targeting in their prevention outreach efforts. And as we can see, the groups that are the least frequently targeted are not only those that tend to be most at risk, but also those that tend to come from historically underrepresented populations. What's more, when it comes to substance misuse, and many of you may be familiar with the work of Rhonda Washington at the University of Wisconsin, who actually used her alcohol EDU data to conduct the color of drinking study, but found some really profound data. So 65% of students of color there said that alcohol culture affected their campus experience, and almost half said that they experienced microaggressions from intoxicated other students. So in this case, it wasn't the drinking of individual students that was having an impact, it was the drinking of other students that was having an impact on students of color. Jesse, any additional thoughts on this or perspectives that you want to add?
No, I think that concept of the impact of the drinking of other students is one that I want to understand its importance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about intersectional and equity-based mental well-being. But that idea of racial battle fatigue certainly comes to bear, as well as microaggressions when we talk about the ecosystem and the conditions that we support, not for students of color who are the ones who are perpetrators of high-risk drinking, but the impact that they receive, and how are we creating safety, not only physical safety, but also psychological safety for those students on campus as well.
And that brings us to tactics 2 and 3. So the tactic 2, in terms of creating an environment of psychological safety as it relates to inclusive excellence, is to employ effective, accessible, inclusive messaging with a focus on the unique needs of your students, particularly those from historically underrepresented groups. Consider the messaging that you're putting out around some of the topics that we're mandated to educate on, right? Sexual assault prevention, interpersonal violence, high-risk drinking or drinking at all. And consider how those messages might be received by different types of students within your community, and really focus on those students that you're striving to help feel more psychologically safe. Second, hold a high standard that's consistently administered, including an audit of student conduct as it's disaggregated by student race and gender. Understand, are some of the challenges that we're facing nationally as it relates to law enforcement and the enforcement of crimes in certain cases, how is that playing out within our community? Are there biases that are being deployed, and how could that be impacting the ways in which our students are able to bring their most authentic selves to school?
And if there's one additional tactic, Erin, that I could add to this, and you don't see it reflected here, but I think it's important to underscore, is the idea that broadly, effectively, and regularly socializing the reporting policies are critically important to amplifying feelings of psychological safety. And why is that? I think it can feel a little bit adjacent to talk about policy promotion when it comes to promoting psychological safety, but the removal of ambiguity and understanding clear expectations of what do I do and where do I go if something does happen to me on campus. If I am experiencing a microaggression or an active bias, being able to say broadly and clearly, and being able to navigate that process relatively effectively and easily for students is one way to know that there's an assurance that while we are working on the conditions of creating psychological safety for everyone, in the instances of a misstep or in the instances of an observance of bias or an act of bias, knowing where to go and how to escalate that issue is a clear way to create and enhance feelings of psychological safety. And now we'll turn our attention to, and this is a visual that really reflects, for me, when social justice and art intersect, I think some really powerful things come to life. And so I'll quickly describe what is being visualized on the screen now. What this looks like is above, we're having a conversation. There are lots of words to indicate a conversation about addressing mental health. But in order to do so, and to do so through an intersectional lens of identity, to do so in an equitable way, we have to understand and dig a little bit deeper, what you see indicated by a shovel going into 3 layers of dirt, if you will, to get to some of those systemic structural issues and root cause issues that come to bear when it comes to providing equitable mental health. And so while at the top we understand mental health through possibly a medical model or pathologizing or looking at the individual issues, in order to genuinely understand mental health and its intersection between equity, infrastructural racism, interpersonal racism, we have to unpack some of these systems, some of these issues that students are bringing to campus. And so while it might present as defiant, when you unpack some of that, it's the intersection and the impact of poverty. Going back to those educational barrier or the barriers to educational attainment that we talked about a little bit earlier, have students experienced, as an example, adverse childhood experiences? Are there issues of racial battle fatigue or the exhaustion of microaggressions? Knowing that there's the mass incarceration system or the school to prison pipeline that some students are understanding and experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And then also having equitable access to housing and healthcare and some of the systems and the basic necessities that Erin outlined a little bit earlier. And then also take into account that there are issues around sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and those come together sometimes in a confluence for students who are carrying multiple identities. And so we consider, what does it mean to provide equitable mental well-being care for students? We have to do so through the lens that there are layers to how we address that, and there are intervention types that we have to consider in a culturally intelligent way.
Thank you for that, Jessie. I always appreciate hearing you speak to this particular graphic and really appreciate the graphic itself. So now we'll go a little bit deeper into understanding student mental health through data. And this data synopsis is going to serve as an example that I hope to create a point from as we go through. So this is some high-level data related to a national data set of students. Obviously, data is coming out fast and furious as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, and many of us are still seeking to understand what exactly are we learning about our student body as it relates to how this has impacted them, and much of that is still to be determined. But here's some aggregate data that looks at how are students doing. So this is a glimpse at student mental health. It indicates that 28% have experienced a depressive episode in the past year. 42% in aggregate reported that they felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. 14% had seriously considered attempting suicide, and 8% reported that they had actually made a plan for ending their life. We know that there was recent CDC data that actually suggested that 1 in 4 18 to 24-year-olds had seriously contemplated suicide during the pandemic. But the point here is that as we get data and as it becomes available to us, it's critically important that we take that data and look deeper and seek to understand, okay, here's what we know about the issue. How can we drill into it a little bit deeper to understand, are there student populations that are being impacted differently than others? Because what we learn is typically yes.
And as is visualized here, the answer to Erin's question is yes. When you disaggregate those same questions around experiencing a depressive episode, all the way to having a plan or having made a plan for suicide, what you're seeing reflected here is an unevenness across this experience when you disaggregate that data by race and ethnicity. And so if we look at, as an example, the bottom right quartile, students who have made a plan to attempt suicide, you'll see here, again, that is when you disaggregate that by race and ethnicity, students of color and students who identify as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander have at a higher rate reported that they have made a plan for attempting suicide. And then also, if you look at the top right quartile, that they felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. Again, that is experienced in a very uneven way. And so as we talk about looking at the aggregate data, disaggregating by demographics, and again, race and ethnicity is just one demographic cut that we recommend you make. You can do that by a variety of demographic identities. And then also what is remarkably powerful is to look at the intersection of those identities. So as an example, a student who is gender nonconforming, who identifies as African American, who also happens to be a part of the first generation population community, what are the distinct needs and interventions that are necessary to meet at that level of experience as well?
And along those lines, we shared the aggregated data statistic that 28% of all students have experienced a depressive episode in the past year. But when we look further at those data, we see that there are staggering differences among certain student populations once we disaggregate it. So we see that the number nearly triples for trans male, gender nonconforming, lesbian, and bisexual students. We also see that this number is higher for Black and African American students at 33%. We see something similar in the data point around feeling so depressed that it's difficult to function. Here we see that that number is doubled for gender nonconforming students and nearly doubled for queer spectrum, trans spectrum students, as well as Hispanic Latinx students. We also have data that looks at who students will go to for help. And so this is data that has surfaced in a variety of different settings, but it asks students, who are you most likely to talk to when you experience stress or emotional challenges? And we see that the two most common types are friends and parents, and that less students are more likely to go to a counselor. So as we're thinking about the role of psychological safety, it's also really important that we're thinking about how are we empowering others within our community or within the peripheral community of our students to support them, to know what to say, to know how to say it, to cast as wide of a net as we possibly can around the students that exist within our community that live there. And then finally, when we look at those who have considered attempting suicide at least once, or those who have made a plan for doing so, we see that those numbers are significantly higher for queer spectrum and trans spectrum students, and in particular, trans male students who endorse it at significantly higher rates than the aggregate of all students. Now, of course, it's worth noting, and I said it at the beginning, and I'll put an asterisk on it, that this may look different in each campus community. So if you have data, this is a great opportunity to access it and to really look deep at the needs of the students that exist within your community so that you can make sure you have resources in place to support those who may be endorsing higher rates of mental health challenges coming in. And then finally, we have data that looks at student disability status. And so this is another area that we see some staggering differences between aggregated and disaggregated data. As we can see, students with disabilities experience depression and suicidal ideation at much higher rates, but 60% do not plan to see a counselor at school. So they're much less likely than the average of all students to report that they want to see a counselor. It's important to think about why this might be, and there's a number of reasons that could be at play. So thinking about if this is the case at your institution, or knowing this anecdotally at a national level, is there a bridge between the Disability Services Office and the counseling office? What is it about the counseling office that may be making students not feel like they are going to seek out help should they need it, and increasing the access that exists there?
As we continue on, and I'm also noting the short amount of time that we have left with these folks, I did want to lift up a comment that Jason made in the chat that at our center, we try to relay the message that counseling is not a catch-all term in mental health support, and it's important to reinforce the natural supports there as well. And so I think that is remarkably important in terms of the intentionality and the power of the language that's used and then also, diversifying the language types, the labels that we identify, or how we lift up what support looks like. And so thank you, Jason, for that contribution. So I'll pause there and let you get back to your tactic, Erin.
No, and that's perfect. Thank you, Jason, for raising that. I didn't see the chat when I was looking at the screen, but certainly appreciate and recognize that. So the fourth tactic is to align mental health and wellness with student success. I think that kind of brings up the point of counseling not being a catch-all term. Mental health is also, not necessarily a catch-all term. Mental health research has shown is directly connected with student success, particularly for students that may be entering college, experiencing some of those barriers that Jesse so eloquently highlighted in one of the first slides. So thinking about ways in which we can get the resources that we need to support student mental health by taking it out of just being something that exists within the counseling center and really embedding it through the culture of all that we do. So with that, we're going to move on, recognizing where we are for time, to our 5, 6, and 7 tactics. The fifth tactic is, as we've illustrated, disaggregating your data to see what stories emerge within your community. One way to do this is also to conduct a needs assessment, and this is going to be especially important as students are returning to our campus communities if they've been absent for a long time. Understanding, are our students' basic needs being met? Do they need food? Do they need shelter? Do they need technology? Do they need support with a laptop, or, and putting in place mechanisms to enable them to succeed in the way that we need them to? And then finally, a really important point is to make sure that our counseling staff is diverse, so that if a student gets to a point where they do choose to seek out help, is the counselor that they're going to connect with able to connect with them in a meaningful and authentic way? For some students, that might mean having a counselor that looks like them, but for others, it might mean having a counselor that has lived experience in what they have experienced, or has engaged in cultural competency training that has given them an ability and insight into how to interact with students that may come from different backgrounds than them and do so effectively.
One practice, or I would say one resource that I would lift up to that last point about cultural competency, cultural literacy, and cultural intelligence. What we recognize, and Erin lifted up the point that having a reflective lived experience as a student certainly is a way to create a foundation of trust and a positive rapport in a therapeutic relationship. And we also recognize that being able to work with a wide variety and diversity of students is one of the spaces in which we as practitioners need to be able to fill. And so, many of you, or you might be familiar with a tool or a resource called the Intercultural Development Inventory. And for many students and for many administrators, that is a highly utilized tool within the space of studying abroad. And so in preparation for sending students abroad on their exchange experiences, they'll have them go through the Intercultural Development Inventory to really kind of create an assessment of where on the spectrum of intercultural intelligence and intercultural development does that student sit. Being a qualified administrator of this tool, I will say it is as good for someone who is not studying abroad as it is for someone who is. And so as we all, seek to become equitable mental health practitioners, that could be one tool or resource to investigate and explore and integrate into your practice to determine, one, that point of reflection and what are the identities that you're bringing to the table. Where does that put you in terms of the spectrum of intercultural development? And then what are the sets of recommendations or the practices that you can take on and consider to increase and broaden that aperture of intercultural literacy, development, and intelligence? And so I'll pause there. It looks like we're moving directly into the key tactics, which I really appreciate, Erin, given our time. And so I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much. So we've gone through all of these 7 key tactics that we hope will be, at the very least, a starting point. And I think, and Jesse, I feel like you do such a great job of articulating this, but inclusive excellence is a process. And as is mental health, a process, right? There isn't a start and a finish line. It's something that we're continually evolving in and growing in. And so as you consider what key tactics you might be able to bring back to your institutions, think about where you are. Think about where you want to go. Some may be very advanced in your efforts. Some may be just starting out and thinking about how do we make our community a healthy place, a safe place, and a place that fosters psychological safety for all. And take what you can. Leave what you won't, put it to the side, but choose to move forward however feels right for you. We're really grateful for your time today. And Jesse, would love to hear any closing thoughts you have.
have summarized it also beautifully. Erin, thank you for your partnership in having this conversation. And as you all, as we close out our time together here today, again, we will circulate the resources in the slides. And I think there are links to some of the resources within. But I would say, that call to action and that what is the one key tactic that you could pick up and explore with your teams tomorrow, today, in a couple of weeks, to broaden the aperture of what inclusive excellence looks like globally on campus, but then also in the areas that you serve and support, would be the one kind of highlight exclamation mark that I would put on all that you said, Erin.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and hopefully have some time to stretch and take a deep breath and maybe go for a walk if it's beautiful out. Thank you for joining us.